It's really a privilege to have James Wood with us this evening. He is, of course, one of the most respected and influential literary critics in the business. And if you look at his biography to try to discern how he got to be that, it's not surprising to see that first, he started early, and second, he's been at it for some time now. His career began reviewing books for The Guardian, not long after he left Cambridge. In 1995, he moved from Britain to the United States to work at the New Republic, and in 2007, he joined the New Yorker. 2 years later, when he received a National Magazine Award, his pieces were praised for, quote, an incredible level of erudition, trust in his readers' intelligence, and an eye for the art of writing. Along the way, James also took up teaching, first co-teaching with Saul Bellow at Boston University, and then for the past 15 years at Harvard, where he's now professor of the practice of literary criticism. Now, lest you think he was always intent on being a critic, that's not the case. He has said poetry was his first love, and he wrote, in his words, quote, reams and reams of bad verse, before realizing he lacked the qualities of concision and refinement. Then too, he was getting more interested in narrative. His previous publications have included a novel, The Book Against God, and a study of storytelling, how fiction works, as well as several collections of his essays. Now he's out with his second novel, Upstate, a thoughtful, perceptive, and skillfully written story about a father and his two daughters. The book examines the bonds of family and addresses a number of life's big issues, among them the question of happiness and how some people find it a more natural state than others. For a distinguished critic to produce a work of fiction and risk his own talent being judged against his own well-documented standards is, it must be acknowledged, a very courageous act in itself. But James needn't worry. A number of readers have posted very positive comments online, praising the book for its compelling characters, keen sense of place and atmosphere, and insights into family dynamics. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming James Wood.
Thank you very much, Brad, and thank you to this wonderful store, which I've been to a few times, always happily. It's a real pleasure to be back. Thank you for that very generous, too generous, surely, introduction. I'm just going to read from the beginning of the book, and as Bradley was saying, it is a book about shall we say, the unequal and apparently arbitrary distribution of happiness and unhappiness in families, which, as we know, those of us who are parents, can be a source not only of puzzlement but of real anguish. Such it is for one of the protagonists in this book, a 68-year-old Englishman called Alan Querry, who is the father of two adult daughters. One of them, who's 40 years old, Vanessa, teaches philosophy at Skidmore College, and her youngest sister, Helen, is a music producer in London. And they are very different women, and as they were very different children. And one mark of their difference is that Vanessa has always struggled with happiness, struggled with a series of crises and a series of depressive bouts. And it's a particular crisis in her life that brings Alan and Helen, her sister, from England to visit her in upstate New York, hence the title of the book, Upstate. I begin cheerfully, and then it gets a little less cheerful. It's an unhappy thing to be reading some of the less cheerful stuff in this particular week, which has been so blighted by suicide, but I still think it makes sense generally in readings to begin at the beginning of a book rather than to plunge in halfway through or so. That's what I'm going to do. And I will say, for those of you who haven't had a look at it yet, it doesn't stay unremittingly bleak. Perhaps it even ends on an ambiguously optimistic moment. So I'll start at the beginning, and this is Alan, who's going to visit his very aged mum to tell her why he is going to America for a week to visit Vanessa, except that he can't actually tell her because they've never really spoken about this particular issue. First, he would have to go and see his mother. He would tell her something about Vanessa, not everything, of course. The home, 6 miles along a favorite road, was a formidable old place with that grey strictness of the north he loved. But now it looked abandoned. Everything was in wintry abeyance. 4 years she'd been living there, and he was still never sure how to announce himself. It was also ridiculously expensive. He could no longer afford it. What did he get for the money? 2 small rooms rather than 1, extra space for the dark massing of a lifetime's heavy old furniture. And maybe she got 2 biscuits with her tea on Fridays. He made his way through 2 huffing fire doors which bottled a weekend's stale yeast. School food. Outside his mother's room, he gathered himself a bit like a clown, pulling up his trousers, dusting down his coat, and entered with a light knock. The television was off, thank goodness. She was asleep in the chintz chair his father had used as the family throne, issuing directives and decrees from behind his newspaper. She was tiny, sunken. Some of her teeth were out. The old music hall joke, "Her teeth are like stars, they come out at night." But it was early afternoon. As she breathed, something seemed to catch in her throat. She'd always had a large nose, and now she seemed to be reducing around it, shrinking down to bone, the nose tenacious, final, root-like. I have hers, so this will be mine, right enough. He knelt beside her and whispered. She opened her eyes and said, with slight affront, "When did you get here, Alan?" As if he'd been spying on her. "Just a second ago." "Fetch me my teeth, by the side of the bed, please, in the glass." She turned away from him to insert the plate. "Now we need to call for some tea and biscuits. They'll bring it if you ask." As a child in a lower middle-class suburb of Edinburgh, she'd made herself unpopular at school by affecting an English or maybe Anglo-Scots pronunciation. Since his dad's death, her accent seemed to have moved up the ranks again by another notch or 2. It usually had the effect of making her sound slightly irritable. In truth, these days she looked like the mistress. In truth, these days she sounded like the mistress, but looked more like the servant, short, bent, too modestly or shabbily dressed today. "You don't need to wear this shawl thing, do you?" he said, lifting it over her shoulders. "Certainly not. I just put it on for my nap. Thank you. You look very tired. You know, you can't burn your candle at both ends." "A Roman candle, maybe." He just had his 68th birthday. "How are you?" "All right, I suppose, but this English view isn't my landscape, of course," she added, gesturing at the window with splendid authority. "Well, it's not a bad one," he said, looking at the line of leafless trees and the icy hills. He was paying for that English view, and we've been over this. You don't want to live with me. You need your independence, though it would be a lot cheaper if you did move in with us. Absolutely not. I took in your grandmother, as you perfectly well know, and it made my 50s a complete blank. All I did day after day was look after her. I'll never do that to you." In that house, the 2 women had seemed to detest each other. With stealthy expertise, each made the other immovably depressed. "But you want me to visit, and I want to visit you." He took her hand. "You're no good to me 3 hours away up in Scotland, even though you have your own landscape there." He said it gently. The tea arrived, carried by a very red teenage boy. He offered a biscuit to both of them and then left, making sure to take the full plate with him. "Wartime rations round here," said his mother. The young man appeared again. "Mrs. Querry," he said, "I'm supposed to remind you that the residents are gathering at 3:30 in the Sun Lounge for the winter flu vaccination. It's, the booster for them that missed it first time round. Need any help?" "No, I have my son, thank you." The room could have been a lot worse. High ceilings with ornate mouldings, Roman laurels almost, textured wallpaper with chips in it like slivered almonds, though in fact these always made him think of splinters caught under a child's skin, all painted a pleasant cream. And parental things he'd known all his life, a reproduction watercolor of Durham Cathedral, an antique mirror that you couldn't really see yourself in, It looked valuable, but he knew it wasn't. A cushion whose faded lilac cover, bought by him at Heels, London, on the Tottenham Court Road, had not been replaced in 30 years at least. It was all pretty good, or as good as can be when one's whole life has been reduced to souvenirs of selfhood. It was a nice place, but he couldn't afford it any longer. She looked at him with her pale blue eyes, Vanessa's. This whole place is up in arms. My next-door neighbour lost her hearing aid yesterday. She put it in some tissue paper on her bedside table, and the cleaner threw it out by mistake. She thought it was a bit of rubbish. And in the room that's just 2 doors down the hall, Mary Binet is furious because she likes to talk French to another woman here who can understand it. She's the only woman who can. And now Mary's been told to stop talking French by the staff. Apparently, someone else, we all assume it's one of the residents, and I have a very good idea who, has complained that they're speaking a secret language to exclude everyone else. I'll miss it. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but I liked hearing the French. And now the manager is leaving at the end of the month. She's only been here for 6 months. She's Czech, I think, a nice woman, though for some reason she hates to be thought of as Polish. He interrupted her. Ma, I have to go to America for a week. America? Well, well. On business? She'd always enjoyed enunciating those words, so he spoke them back to her with finality. On business. Well, don't get caught up in anything. Caught up in anything? It's a dangerous place, from what I hear. There was that terrible thing with the towers. You'll go and see Vanessa? She's always wanted you to visit her in that place in Saratoga Springs. Yes, I wanted to say sarsaparilla. I will see her. And Josh. Oh, good Lord. Courage there. He's far too young and certainly not good enough for her. You've never even met him. Yes, that's 2 of us, but I do have a telephone, you know. I get reports. And I was about to say, before you interrupted me, that Vanessa isn't getting any younger, is she? Ma, I can't keep up with you. Now you're giving him your blessing? Well, why shouldn't the poor thing have a boyfriend? Maybe Josh is the one. And when they marry, you'll blame him for taking Vanessa away. Oh, Vanessa was already away. Well away. She did her PhD there, not here. That was the beginning. Silly girl. It was a shame she didn't come back at Christmas. I suppose she'd rather spend time with her beau. There was a moment or two of old-fashioned silence. The tick of his mother's fancy carriage clock. His gift. Alan, love, can you help me to the sunroom? I want to get there early, while the needle is still sharp. They smiled at each other, and he helped her up, and went beside her as she gripped the mouse-grey tubular walker, a marvel of engineering, as strong as a weightlifter but as light as the bones of a very old lady, with wheels on the front and 2 splayed yellow tennis balls stuck on the back legs. These dragged along the carpet, as the aged couple, mother and son, moved slowly down the corridor. So I'm skipping a couple of chapters to Alan thinking about the trip he has to make to Saratoga Springs and reviewing in his mind some of the history of his 2 daughters, including his divorce from his wife, which he thinks precipitated a good deal of Vanessa's unhappiness, but also just the general puzzlement of how different they have always been. Vanessa and Helen and Vanessa. Vanessa was the elder by 2 years, born just after 10 o'clock on the evening of July the 30th, 1966, the day England beat West Germany in the World Cup, the one and only time. You couldn't forget that day. Those jubilant hours, the black and white television bringing forth its frail, unlikely pictures, and Cathy walking stiffly around the sitting room, pressing her hand into her lower back, her groans mixed now in his memory with the roars from Wembley Stadium. And there, a little later, Vanessa was, jaundiced and moist, furrowed with folds, most loved, because the first. A lucky girl. But as she got older, she became harder to embrace, awkward, softly distant. She didn't or wouldn't fit, like Alice in Wonderland, either too tall or too short. It was the divorce that changed everything. After Cathy walked out, Vanessa withdrew. The girls dealt differently with that catastrophe. Always fierce, Helen sided with her father and accused her mother, who had, after all, left Alan for another man, of being obsessed with sex. She was only 13, poor thing. Vanessa was different. She took no sides, just went quiet, seemed to absorb all the consequences of the event and disappeared from sight. She was always upstairs in that damn bedroom of hers, where she lay on her bed and read, massively, widely, seriously, novels, poetry, philosophy, feminism, even ecology. He'd never heard of most of her authors. Sometimes he thought she chose the most obscure people she could just to spite him. In happier times, Alan and Cathy had loved to observe the differences between their daughters. How often in the evening, when other conversation faltered, the two parents talked about the girls with the kind of fanatical wonderment, monotonous but somehow never boring, that revolutionaries must lavish on their plans for the future. Helen was exuberant, playful, disobedient, physical. Vanessa was shy, gentle, slow to anger, studious, very private. For a while, these differences seemed provisional, part of the scramble of growing up. Everything was potential. But eventually, so Alan discovered, the child's feet stopped growing. Her trousers don't need to be let out anymore. Her handwriting has the form it will have for the rest of her life. Her bedsheets bear the occasional but unmistakable bloodstains of new adolescence. And as if suddenly, while you were not properly attending to the matter, or so it seemed to him now, while you were too busy with your own foolish crises, your daughter became an adult. And those qualities that had seemed malleable were now hardened and fixed. Both girls were full of will, but while Helen's willfulness seemed to bring her pleasure, Vanessa's brought her unhappiness. She seemed so keen to mess up her own chances. That was the phrase he kept on reciting to himself in those days. Why did she want to mess up her own chances? Why didn't Van invite any school friends over to the house? Didn't she have any friends? She said she wanted to put herself forward for the school debating society, but that never happened. It was the same with the school orchestra, the school play. All her pastimes were solitary, reading, playing the piano or the flute, listening to music, writing poems mostly full of despair and lament. One of them was especially horrifying. It seemed to be about some unrequited crush on a boy, and it ended with a line he would never forget about wanting to jump from a high wall onto a hard pavement. These poems greatly alarmed her parents when they discovered them in a notebook hidden under Van's mattress. Later, a student at Oxford, Vanessa decided that she would give away all her possessions. A friend was so worried about her stability that she reported her to the University Health Services, who contacted Alan and Cathy. Helen spoke so easily to adults, confident in her ability to charm. Vanessa held back in a gesture that seemed to combine, worst of all worlds, judgment and fear. Helen was naturally joyful. Van needed to be reminded of that category of human experience. And one day, you realize that your children's differences are not only temperamental and biological, but also moral and political. That each has a very distinct worldview. One day, he remembered it well, you witness your elder daughter, now 17, firmly lecturing her younger sister about the misery of life and the cruelty of all human beings, of all life, holding up a book her father had no idea she possessed, George Riley Scott's History of Torture, waving it around and saying, "Read this, Helen, and you won't have any doubts about it." Is that how it had been? Her childhood a torture? Helen and Vanessa, Vanessa and Helen. Vanessa did her doctorate at Princeton, because I'm stifled in Oxford and they'll pay for me to be at Princeton, and they actually want me there, and had been 7 years teaching philosophy at Skidmore College. There was now a faint suggestion, like a breeze carrying a smell of rot with it, of a career stagnating, of unfulfilled promise. There had been a few papers, one of them which Alan understood to be about how to combine French philosophy and English analytic philosophy in order to make a great new product, like combining French grapes and English soil to make that questionable wine they were now producing in Kent, did fairly well and bounced around the conference circuit. But now she was 40, and there had been no big book and no advancement. The same faculty profile and atrocious snapshot sat on the departmental website for all these years. These academics, thought Alan. Vanessa's beautiful dark hair pulled harshly tight at the back into a scholarly bun, her lovely intelligent face obscured by hideous clock-sized spectacles, and that fixed bibliography, with the eternally dangling promise of 4 essays on personhood forthcoming. Alan couldn't imagine her in Saratoga Springs, New York. She told him that Skidmore College was one of the best private institutions in America, and she told him something about the town, about its history as a vacation resort, a 19th century spa with healing waters, the Baden-Baden, the Vichy of upstate New York. It was full of parks and grand hotels. People still gambled and raced horses there, and there were handsome, wide streets. 5 years ago, he was reading Diamonds Are Forever. He'd been rereading all the Ian Fleming books on a whim, and was chuffed to see that James Bond and Felix Leiter visited the famous horse track at the very same Saratoga Springs. But he didn't go to see her. She came to him, and he imagined that she came to Northumberland every summer because she was keen to escape America or keen to escape New York State. In summer, in Northumberland, the sheep made their pleated, laugh-like noises and rubbed their wool onto the dry stone walls, and the straight old Roman roads glimmered in the broad, gentle light, and there was really no better place to be on earth. Last summer she had come for the whole of August. He liked that very much. He left her alone for a few days, went down to London, and when he came back, there she was, still there. Sometimes in her old bedroom, lying diagonally on the bed in her usual way, reading a book, sometimes in the sitting room or outside on the lawn in a deck chair, smoking, always with a book and a pen in hand, wearing those curious baggy trousers. Unlike Helen, Vanessa seemed to need very little. She wanted to be at home, to be intermittently alone, and to be able to work. Little else. From the back door he could see her in the deck chair, notebook open, pen in hand, cigarette packet and lighter on the grass beside her coffee cup. She'd got a bit heavier in the last year. Perhaps the curious, wafting trousers were hiding that. She slouched in the chair, her tongue slightly protruding. The notebook was balanced on her knees, and with her right hand she intensely twirled her hair, as if twisting thoughts from her brain. She rarely wrote anything, fascinating the ratio of thought to frequency of writing. She was like a trumpeter playing Haydn in a symphony, picking up the instrument only every 100 bars or so. Aphorisms, maybe? Philosophical fragments? It would be funny if she were just writing jokes, or writing a letter, or doodling aimlessly. And though he knew he shouldn't, he would go out and disturb her, offer her some more coffee, ask her if she needed anything from Corbridge, tell her one of his own jokes to match those in her notebook. Had she really tried to do herself some harm in Saratoga Springs? Put aside her life? He kept coming back to this image, like a half-finished crossword puzzle. Of course, thought Alan, Josh had been deliberately vague with Helen when he described the incident on the stairs, probably because he wanted to ration the alarm, enough to get them to come, but not so much that they would insist on taking Vanessa home with them. Josh must love her then. He was possessive in the right way, watchful in the right way, and obviously kind. Alan thought the email reflected pretty well on the young man. After Vanessa ran away from boarding school, Alan and Kathy decided that she should see someone about her depression and anxiety. They found a child therapist in Newcastle who was attached in some way to the teaching hospital there. She was hard to find, he remembered. No one had therapy in Newcastle in 1982. And Vanessa did not want to go, had to be almost dragged into the grim office on Percy Street. Worse, much worse, the therapist, her last name was Lennon, like John, insisted that she wanted to see the whole family for the first session, all of them, even Helen. Alan and Kathy had been separated for 8 months and had stopped communicating except to talk about matters related to the girls. Alan sat there in a fury as Dr. Lennon told them that she was going to use a tape recorder. She found it useful to listen to them talking, to detect, after the session, their recorded hesitations and evasions and weaknesses and lies. Of course, she didn't put it quite like that, but that was the gist. Cherchez the parents, find out how the parents were to blame, and stitch them up. And they were to blame. Of course they were. Poor Vanessa, she cried and cried while the little gap-toothed wheels of the Memorex cassette squeakily rotated, while Alan and Kathy tried to explain how hard things had been for the girls. And yet, Helen did not cry, did she? Dr. Lennon then had 4 sessions with Van on her own, and when it was all over, she called in the despicable parents and explained that she couldn't, of course, share any details of what Vanessa had told her, just what had Van told her. But she certainly could inform them that, in her opinion, their elder daughter was extremely anxious and severely depressed. The therapist recommended that Vanessa write about her fears and sadness in creative form. Alan didn't mention that Van was already doing that. Van did get better, happier, more fulfilled in her academic work, drawn out by the task of serious philosophy. The last 2 years of school and the first year at Oxford were comparatively serene. Everything was comparative in Van's case. But then she collapsed again in her final year at Oxford and tried to give away all her possessions to her friends and had to be brought home by Helen. And at that time she spoke of being pursued by what she called her demons. Had she intended to harm herself at Oxford? Was she thinking of suicide? He could hardly bear to think, let alone speak, that word. He had to look away from it, as from the sun. And perhaps it was true, he now thought, that because he looked away from that word, he had also looked away from the other word, depression. He looked away, and by the time Van was in her mid-20s, Alan had decided that most of Vanessa's problems were not really chronic, but largely related to her solitude. She never seemed to have a boyfriend. She read books all day, hard, systematically unhelpful books as he saw it. She took no exercise, never went for a walk or a bike ride. Ma wasn't correct when she said that if Josh were the one, Alan would blame the lad for taking his daughter away. Not at all. He welcomed Josh with relief. The news about a boyfriend was received as another parent might receive news about a child's new job or first house. And the truth was, Vanessa had been much happier in recent months, since she and Josh started going out in June. She was full of new projects and resolve, as he saw in the summer when she sat happily in the deck chair, carefully answering her philosophical riddles. He tried hard to keep this summery Vanessa in his mind, not the girl who disappeared for 2 days when she was 15, or refused to get out of bed for what seemed like a whole month when she was 21, or who very nearly abandoned her PhD 4 years later and spoke seriously about opening an organic restaurant in Corbridge, or who was about to turn down the offer of the assistant professorship at Skidmore and come home to England without a job because what's the point of teaching philosophy? What he strongly remembered today was walking with Vanessa when she was 5 or 6 past the medieval church in the village, the church which flew a red-on-white St. George's flag from its tower. In the northern wind, the flapping cloth pulled away from the metal pole like a young soldier eager to dash into battle. That day, it was at half-mast, and little Vanessa, happy Vanessa, asked him what that meant. Someone prominent had died, he said. For several years afterward, when they went past the church and the flag was back at full mast, Van would look up and announce with satisfaction, "No one died today." Thank you. So, I'd be very, very happy to take questions. Brad wanted me to remind you that if you wouldn't mind speaking into the microphone because it's being taped for your questions. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Well, thank you very much for coming and reading those very fascinating excerpts from your new book.
Thank you.
I'm curious as to how your joint experience of living part of your life in the UK and part of your life in the US has influenced your the decisions you made about the characters and the plot of Upstate.
Thank you very much. It's not clear yet from the book, except from my plot summary, of course. But it's very much a sort of split state book. It's set in upstate New York because after the first chapter or two, Alan and Helen are there visiting Vanessa. But of course, Alan remains an Englishman. And one of the things I wanted to do was, so Alan has only once been to the States before. 21 years before he came to New York City for a business trip. America hasn't really featured in his life, and as you can tell from what I was reading, he's been pretty complacent about the reality of his daughter's American life. He doesn't go to his daughter comes to him. And of course, if you think about the implications of that, when an adult child comes to visit you in your house and in the house she grew up in, she reverts structurally to being your child again. You don't actually have to deal with her particularly as an adult. You retain possession. So he has to go to her, and that's a change, of course. But the other change is he has to discover what her American life has been like, to make the effort to find its reality. And I wanted to do that, and I wanted to see. I wanted that gradually to open up to him, and I also wanted to take a fairly typical older English person who has rested on a fairly standard reflexive anti-Americanism, not a violent anti-Americanism, but the kind that you encounter in Europe pretty regularly, and slowly expose him to a strange American landscape and reality, which at first strikes him as sort of annoying or alienating or just different, and slowly begins to seem lively and vital and interesting to him, and also to have certain similarities that he never expected to find. That's to say, if you're an Englishman and you go to New York, and New York is crazy and radically different and other and always will be. If you're an Englishman who grew up in the north of England, specifically near Newcastle, as Alan did, and you find yourself in upstate New York, well, Saratoga Springs, I guess, is its own world, but 20 or 30 miles south of Saratoga Springs, which features in the book, is the city of Troy. And it turns out that the city of Troy, some of you will know, has a history extremely like the history of Newcastle, a city that built its prosperity in the 19th century on steel and had to watch it disappear. And all of you will know that upstate New York has suffered quite a bit of economic blight that would be familiar to Alan from his experiences in the north of England, whose prosperity was also built on steel but also coal. So that's what I wanted to get all that mobilized in addition to the family stuff about happiness and unhappiness. Thank you.
And are there any personal dimensions at all in the in the story that come from your own?
Very much so. I mean, I grew up in the north of England, not far from Newcastle, so I know that landscape well, and I know upstate New York quite well for a number of reasons, mainly academic ones to do with sort of visiting Saratoga Springs a fair amount, and also visiting Bennington, which is 30 miles away in Vermont, somewhat similar but more depressed town than a good deal more depressed than Saratoga Springs. I mean, I've been here since 1995, but I still have if you spend the first 30 years of your life somewhere else, of course you probably don't ever feel native to the country that you immigrated to, however gratefully you immigrated to it. And so I tend to see things with a certain doubleness of vision, a slight estrangement from it, which I think can be useful for writing, and certainly was helpful when I was writing the book, because it was easy, relatively speaking, for me to see America through Alan's eyes. And one thing before I really even knew where the book was going or where it ended, I always knew I wanted Alan and his daughter to arrive in New York, and I wanted them to take that great train journey up the Hudson Valley to Albany and up to Saratoga Springs, because it's just one of those astonishing, majestic journeys that isn't really, if you come from, I guess you can find it up in Scotland, but if you come from the UK, there's nothing quite like it. When you leave New York City and go up the Hudson, see these massive bluffs and, the stations and so on. It's a fantastic landscape. So I always knew that was going to be a chapter in the book.
This is embarrassing. This is probably the most obvious question to you of all. But having thought so deeply, not only about different writers critically, but also the art of writing fiction, when it comes time, that spark, and you said, I'm going to do this myself. What problems arise for you, if at all, in making that switch, having thought so deeply about the mechanics of writing?
Well, this is going to be a sort of cop-out answer, but I would say, in some ways, I think doing all that thinking about fiction makes it easier, and in some ways, it makes it harder. So the easiness is pretty obvious. I guess both elements are pretty obvious to you. The easiness is that, yes, it turns out to be quite helpful, I think, to spend a great deal of time thinking about living in the novel, thinking about the novel, what it's doing, how it's doing it. It's been helpful to me to teach fiction and to read it more slowly than book reviews allow me to do. On the other hand, and here I think is perhaps the implication of your question, we also know that artists need to put to sleep a certain sort of critical monitor at times. I mean, I think just to sink themselves into something, they need to. There's this wonderful phrase of V.S. Pritchett's about how an artist needs to fall into the determined stupor out of which great work comes, and I like that idea of being very, moving forward, but as it were in a kind of drowse or dream state or something. And that's probably harder to achieve when the little monitor inside is always saying, well, is this good enough? And does this look like, Flaubert would do it, or blah, blah, blah would do it? That said, I think plenty of artists have that critical monitor going in their heads too. Obviously they have to when they're revising and improving or chucking stuff out. But many writers are also very deep readers. And are constantly thinking about, as we know from the body of criticism written by writers, are constantly thinking about their art critically. So on the whole, I would say it was more of an advantage for me than a disadvantage. These two worlds, yeah.
Great. Well, anyway, thank you also for all your critical work.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
Yes. I would like to think that all of us are more than the sum of our experiences. How do we get beneath the veneer? Everything you've talked about of Skidmore and all, and how people describe each other in those kinds of terms.
Yeah.
And get to the person.
So, do you mean in life or in fiction?
In fiction.
Yeah.
It is so easy for all of us to say, Skidmore, whatever. But it's to get to the inner person that's so hard.
Yeah.
And I don't know how one gets below that.
That makes a lot of sense to me. Well, surely one of the things we go to literature for, and perhaps supremely to the novel, which is such a humane and social art, is that we go to it for a kind of disclosure of truth that is hard to get in real life. I mean, maybe every so often we have that moment with someone we love, or a friend, or something. Or someone we hate, that can be strong too. But a great deal of life, as you suggest, is spent avoiding those moments or not being able to achieve them for whatever reason. Fiction, it would seem to me, gives us, it not only does this beautiful thing, or something I find beautiful, which is it often gives us the form of a life. Again, something very hard to actually express or even see sometimes in our own existences, and we tend not to do it in other people's lives, alas, until we see their obituaries. But novels actually, as it were, give us these living obituaries because they give us the form of a life. So they give us the form of a life, and that seems to me very valuable. And then, of course, they allow us to hear characters speaking, not only speaking to each other in ways that they don't really in ordinary life, in a more heightened or a more truthful or more passionate way, but of course then speaking to themselves, which is what soliloquy is. That seems to me an amazing thing, and it's why we all find fiction such a precious art, or such a precious resource. But what I'd also say, this is a rather pessimistic response to your question, is in my own experience at least, it's not just that in social life we often fail to get beneath. My own experience is that often family life obstructs truthful communication too. That people have fallen into certain patterns. Maybe I'm talking here about an English family, but certain patterns of reticence, modesty, shyness, competition, resentment, and all these form a hard crust over truthfulness, so that you get to a point often in family life where it would be too it would be too much of an eruption to break that crust, right? You don't like what might come up, and so it's easier, there's unfortunately a great deal. Well, one of the things I love about American life is that it tends not to run on those principles, or at least in my romantic version of it. Whereas I think a lot of English life, unfortunately, is premised on a kind of equilibrium, a sort of easiness. And say when I look at my parents, my mother was a somewhat depressive character, and actually her mother, my grandmother, had some sort of nervous breakdown and had electroconvulsive therapy and so on. And I allude to that in the book, and in some ways I suppose it's the germ of the book. But also, at least my mother had strong emotions that she wore on her sleeve. Sometimes they weren't always pleasant, but there was passion there. Joy and hatred, anger and love. My father, by comparison, is sort of enigmatically even-keeled, and has always been, in some ways, that's actually, if in familial terms, that's a fantastic ground actually for a father. I mean, for a child to have in a father, I think. Because it's premised on a certain constancy of presence, and it's also premised on not being afraid. And I think it's, many children are afraid of their fathers, and I certainly never was. So I'm grateful for that. But I think it would be fair to say his existence was about playing it cool and not revealing anything. And so as a kid, I was able to see these two very different studies in human communication. Yeah. Yeah.
Can you talk a little more about just the general subject of depression? Because as you alluded to in your remarks, it's certainly in the news these days in the wake of the suicides of Kate Spade and today Anthony Bourdain.
Yeah.
And I gather, because of your own family experience, it's something you've been thinking about for a long time. Did you have to do more research for the book? And what advice do you have for those of us now trying to understand it better?
Yeah. I didn't do any research, but yes, I thought a good deal about it. So as I suggested, in relation to my own upbringing, and then the extra thing of being a parent. I don't have adult kids; my kids are still teenagers. But inevitably, having children is a lesson in what you can and can't control. And I think it's fair to say parents tend to start out in the early years with a certain kind of vanity and narcissism, which is, this is the clay I've produced. I'm just going to press my thumbs into it, and they'll just turn out like me, because obviously I'm the best version of what could possibly be. She'll play the oboe. He'll play the drums, whatever it is, right? Then, usually in happy ways, they turn out to be quite extraordinarily different from you. Turns out he can play football and is actually great with his body, and that's really weird because I was terrible at sports. Great, isn't that a plus? That's a surplus. As I say, most of that is happy, and we accept as part of the sort of arbitrariness and fortune of life that certain aptitudes are more or less inherited. Intelligence, whatever, musical ability, athletic ability. They can get jolts, of course, and they can get crushed down by life events. But it would seem that there's a strong genetic predisposition here. What if that were also the case with happiness and unhappiness? Then that becomes a very sad thing to think about. And of course, a very sad prospect for any parent to realize that they might not be able very much to change the unhappiness of a child. So this is the sort of thing I was trying to think about in the novel, and I don't know. In terms of, I don't have any advice any more than anyone else does, except that to go back to the earlier question, clearly communication and talking is absolutely the first step. And what would be the other practical piece of advice? It would be don't take drugs. Alas, that would be the seems to be the case in the most recent piece of news. Any other questions? Yeah.
I know how busy you are. I'm just wondering when you wrote this novel, how long it gestated. Yeah. And also, in what tradition you feel you're working in, since you're always commenting on every other author. Yeah. Your influences with this novel in mind, particularly.
Absolutely. Thank you. It took a bit longer than it should have done, to be honest. And that's because it did. I would sometimes stop for several months at a time, which I think probably most sort of professional writers would tell you is a terrible thing to do. Because, of course, you do lose a thread and you need to. It takes a long time to pick something back up. But I didn't really have any choice. Because I didn't have any formal time off. Most of the time, I could sort of fit it around reviews, but then a big piece would come, and somehow it just seemed, if you're doing sort of a 5,000-word piece or something, it just seemed impossible to do the two things at once, and I would just stop. Or maybe it was being, looking after my kids or whatever it was, teaching. All these things would get in the way. So it probably took, when it really should have only taken, it's a short book, it really should have only taken a couple of years. It probably took about 4 years to do because of these interruptions.
Do you remember the beginning, the seed?
Yes, absolutely. I've been thinking about it for a long time and sort of writing it in my head in that useful way I think that everyone does, probably for 8 or 9 years. Absolutely. It's a good question about what tradition it belongs to. And I suppose the question would be a symptom of the thing that we were talking about earlier, right? And something perhaps to avoid, right? The critical monitor. I mean, I think you need, as I said, you obviously need to be critical. You're looking at your own work. You're chucking stuff out. This won't come up to grade. This is okay, etc. But when you're getting in, when there's another level of a sort of meta level of investigation or self-criticism, where you're thinking, does this belong in the tradition of Flaubert and Tolstoy or whatever, then I think that's probably not good for one's work.
But do you think you're like anyone else?
I'll tell you what I was trying to do. I mean, you can probably tell from the reading, I like language, I like style, and I like writing stylishly if I can. But I was also trying to write quite simply. And to keep a fairly simple musical flow going, often pegged to a character's thoughts, as you could hear there in the later stuff. And I suppose I've increasingly begun to think of simplicity, not minimalism, but just a sort of directness and simplicity as actually being outside traditions. Do you know what I mean?
Oh,
yeah.
Interesting. Yeah.
I mean, because often when I'm teaching, simplicity is the thing that everyone can see it right there, but it's the thing that's very hard to explain, right? It's often the thing that's very hard to have anything clever to say about, and yet we're all moved by it. Same in music, I think, too.
Just a sort of boiled down philosophical flourish.
In some way, yeah. I like that, yeah. Something like that, yes. But I mean, think of it in music, right? We all know what complex music is, and we pay proper obeisance to it. The complex symphony, whatever, or the complex, prog rock song from the 70s. And then we also know what simplicity is too, which is a folk song that just pierces you. Or actually a very simple pop song that has all the qualities of a simple folk song and just goes straight to your heart. What's that?
Earned, I think.
Yeah.
Earned.
Yeah.
Hard work.
Yeah, indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I was intrigued by the bit that you read from the book, and one of the things that struck me even before you started talking about it was the father whom you described and his both concern for his daughter, but the sense of complacency or separateness or a lack of communication. And I was wondering, in the book, do you give him do you give forth a sense of how that came to be, or is it a given?
It's something of a given, though I should have said in the introduction that he's Alan's origins are working class from Newcastle and Durham, and he's pretty much a self-made man, and he's made money from, reasonable amount of it. He's not super rich, but he's done well. He formed his own company which built things. He was a property developer, a sort of mini Trump, as it were, very mini Trump, which is the right Trump to be, it has to be said. And I think I do touch on it every so often that he has at certain times felt that he actually needed to avoid being too involved in his children's life, because if he did, he would get sucked into it. He would be so engrossed by it that it would become a kind of fanaticism that would have stopped him doing the other thing he needed to do, which was build his own company. In other words, there's been a certain cost, as there often is in families, to the success of one or more parents. So that's the given in a way. But I wanted the American experiences to sort of jolt him into, partly because he begins to understand how unhappy his daughter has been, but also because I wanted America itself to jolt him a bit. Yeah. Yes. Okay, this is the last question.
So I'm listening to you talk about the story and knowing your nonfiction writing and how beautifully analytical it is and how much I read into it. And then to hear you read the story and say that you thought about it 8 or 9 years.
Yeah.
I'm wondering how many surprises you had. How much of it did it take your unconscious in other down dark alleys, and how much of this other side of you, which I'm not familiar with, was engaged.
Thank you. Well, I'll tell you something. This isn't meant vainly. One of the surprises to me was that, relatively speaking, it was quite easy to write, and I hadn't expected that, because I find writing criticism. I've got better at it, and so I've got faster at it, but I don't find it particularly easy to write. I do a lot of stopping and starting and not knowing exactly where to, place a paragraph or something. And there were certain chapters in this book that really seemed to write themselves. I would just sit down and at the end of the morning, I would have pretty much what eventually, I put into the book. That was a really pleasant surprise for me. And the other corollary of that is that I enjoyed writing it. Almost at every moment I was writing it, I enjoyed writing it. That, again, isn't something I could... It's sometimes true about writing criticism, but not regularly. Here I felt it was exciting to be following a story, and you're right to imply that there's an element of surprise in that even though I knew pretty much where it was going to go and I knew how it was going to end, I think any writer will say that when embarking on a scene, they cannot know exactly what the curves and twists are going to be in the scene they're writing, and if they did, that it probably would it wouldn't be very good fiction. That they have to be feeling something, which is, I suppose, feeling a rhythm, really, isn't it? It's feeling a sort of beat of something, and that was for me, writing this book, a completely happy experience, despite the sometimes dark material.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much.